In 1760, New York City occupied the southern tip of Manhattan Island, bounded by rivers that shaped every movement of trade, defense, and daily labor within its compact colonial streets and crowded waterfront wharves along the East River shoreline. The city's natural harbor, deep and protected, positioned it strategically between Atlantic commerce and the interior Hudson Valley, encouraging merchants to consolidate shipping networks that linked Caribbean plantations, British manufacturers, and northern frontier settlements through coordinated port exchanges regularly. Streets radiated northward from the Battery, following irregular property lines rather than a formal grid, reflecting Dutch origins and subsequent English administration that prioritized immediate commercial access over long-term urban planning considerations within the growing provincial capital community structure. By the early 1760s, a population approaching 18,000 resided within this narrow peninsula, creating dense neighborhoods where artisans, dockworkers, enslaved Africans, and merchants lived in close proximity under British imperial governance and established municipal institutions of authority locally. Economic life revolved around maritime exchange, as wheat and flour from upstate farms moved down the Hudson, while imported textiles, molasses, and manufactured goods circulated through counting houses clustered along the East River docks, sustaining credit and insurance markets locally. This trade depended upon credit extended across the Atlantic, binding New York's merchants to London financiers whose expectations influenced prices, shipping schedules, and the colony's vulnerability to imperial policy changes in times of war and peacetime adjustment alike abroad. Enslaved labor formed a significant component of the urban workforce, particularly on docks and in households, revealing a social hierarchy that contradicted emerging colonial rhetoric about liberty and rights within the British Atlantic world of commerce and governance structures. Municipal governance rested with a mayor and common council appointed under royal authority, ensuring that imperial interests remained embedded within local decision-making about taxation, policing, and public works and regulatory oversight of the harbor and markets alike throughout city. Following Britain's costly victory in the 7 Years' War, imperial officials sought revenue from American colonies, introducing new customs enforcement and taxation measures that would alter New York's commercial calculations and strain relations between merchants and royal administrators locally. The Stamp Act crisis reached the city in 1765, prompting organized resistance from merchants and artisans who feared economic contraction and constitutional overreach under parliamentary authority, leading to coordinated boycotts and public demonstrations along Broadway and the waterfront streets. Sons of Liberty organized meetings and symbolic protests, asserting colonial rights while remaining formally within the British Empire, a position that reflected both ideological caution and commercial pragmatism among New York's trading elites and skilled craftsman communities at time. Tensions periodically erupted into violence, most notably during confrontations between soldiers and civilians, revealing how military presence within a crowded port city intensified disputes over authority and everyday urban order in taverns, streets, and public squares alike across Manhattan. Despite unrest, commercial activity persisted, as merchants calculated risks and adjusted supply chains, demonstrating the city's resilience and its dependence on predictable Atlantic connections for sustained prosperity within the framework of imperial regulation and wartime uncertainty cycles during period. Geographically, the Hudson River corridor granted access deep into the continent, allowing New York to function as an intermediary between inland agricultural producers and Atlantic shipping routes, which strengthened its competitive position against rival colonial ports in North America. This strategic position fostered investment in wharves, warehouses, and shipyards, embedding maritime infrastructure into the city's physical landscape and reinforcing patterns of settlement oriented toward the waterfront along the East and Hudson River edges during the late colonial decades. At the same time, inequalities hardened, as property ownership concentrated among established families, shaping political influence and limiting broader participation in civic decision-making processes across wards and parishes within the expanding municipal jurisdiction boundaries of late 18th century New York. Religious institutions, including Anglican, Dutch Reformed, and Presbyterian congregations, structured community life, providing charitable relief and educational instruction while also reinforcing ethnic and political alignments within the plural society of colonial Manhattan Island neighborhoods during the 1760s and 1770s. Print culture expanded through newspapers and pamphlets, circulating arguments about taxation and representation that connected local grievances to broader imperial debates unfolding across British America and fostering a politically engaged reading public in the port city by the 1770s. By the early 1770s, enforcement of the Townshend duties and subsequent repeal cycles created uncertainty that complicated merchants' planning and intensified factional divisions within the city between loyalist officials and patriot committees seeking coordinated resistance strategies before armed conflict. Committees of correspondence emerged to coordinate information, linking New York with other colonial centers and institutionalizing political cooperation beyond informal protest networks in advance of Continental Congress deliberations and intercolonial agreements during the mid-1770s over trade and governance. As tensions escalated toward open rebellion, the city's strategic harbor increased its military significance, drawing imperial attention to fortifications and supply logistics across Manhattan Island and the approaches to the Hudson River estuary during the years before 1776 conflict. Between 1760 and 1775, New York evolved from a prosperous colonial port into a politically mobilized urban center whose geographic advantages and commercial networks positioned it at the threshold of revolutionary transformation within the British Atlantic world order system. In 1776, military conflict transformed New York from a contested colonial port into a central strategic objective within the wider struggle between Britain and the rebelling American colonies along the Atlantic seaboard and Hudson Corridor. General George Washington recognized the city's geographic importance, understanding that control of its harbor and rivers could divide New England from the southern colonies and secure vital supply routes for either side in the conflict. British forces launched a coordinated campaign in the summer of 1776, landing on Staten Island before advancing toward Brooklyn, seeking decisive engagement that would restore imperial authority over the rebellious province and its strategic port facilities. The Battle of Long Island resulted in American defeat, compelling Washington to execute a disciplined nighttime withdrawal across the East River, preserving the Continental Army while conceding control of the city to British occupation forces. By September 1776, British troops occupied Manhattan, establishing New York as their principal North American military base and administrative headquarters for the remainder of the Revolutionary War period. Soon after occupation began, a devastating fire swept through large sections of the city, destroying hundreds of buildings and intensifying hardship among residents already facing military rule and economic disruption. Under British administration, New York became a haven for loyalists fleeing other colonies, altering the city's demographic composition and reinforcing its role as a stronghold of imperial allegiance. The harbor supported a constant movement of warships, transports, and supply vessels, underscoring how geography determined the city's function as a logistical anchor for British campaigns along the Atlantic coast and Hudson Valley. British commanders fortified Manhattan and surrounding positions, constructing defensive works that reflected the city's vulnerability to both landward assault and naval blockade within its constricted island setting. Civilian life adapted to occupation, as markets operated under military oversight and property disputes multiplied, revealing the strain placed on urban institutions during prolonged wartime administration. Enslaved individuals sought freedom by fleeing to British lines, responding to proclamations promising emancipation for service, thereby reshaping the city's labor system and social structure during occupation years. This migration had significant social consequences, weakening established household hierarchies and challenging assumptions about bondage within a city already divided by political allegiance and wartime uncertainty. Economic patterns shifted as privateering, military contracts, and supply provisioning replaced peacetime trade, narrowing commercial opportunities while concentrating wealth among those aligned with occupying authorities. Meanwhile, patriot sympathizers within the city engaged in intelligence gathering and clandestine communication, illustrating the persistence of political resistance despite surveillance and harsh penalties imposed by British officials. The city's prisons and hospital ships became notorious for harsh conditions, reflecting the broader humanitarian toll of protracted conflict within a densely populated urban environment. From 1776 to 1783, New York functioned as the operational center of British strategy in America, directing campaigns while serving as refuge and marketplace within a constrained wartime economy. As the war's momentum shifted after 1778, the city's strategic value endured, yet British prospects for decisive victory gradually diminished across the wider theater of operations. Negotiations in Europe culminated in the Treaty of Paris in 1783, formally recognizing American independence and mandating British evacuation of New York and other occupied territories. In November 1783, British forces departed, and Continental troops re-entered Manhattan, marking a decisive political transformation from imperial headquarters to American-controlled city. The withdrawal prompted thousands of loyalists to evacuate alongside departing troops, creating property vacancies and redistributing economic opportunities among returning patriots and neutral merchants. With sovereignty transferred to the new United States, New York assumed renewed significance as a commercial hub within an independent republic navigating fragile finances and uncertain constitutional arrangements. The occupation years left enduring legacies in fortifications, demographic change, and political alignment, positioning New York at the center of early national debates over governance and economic direction.